If you've been told to pull up your socks, then make sure it's a pair of TNT socks. The TNT shop is now open at tntradio.live. Patrick Henningsen talks on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We're in hour number 2 of this live broadcast. Thank you for rejoining us. Big thank you to our previous guest, former British diplomat and journalist, author Craig Murray. Fantastic discussion, very important discussion covering the ICJ ruling, what it means going forward, not just for Israel, but for those aiding and abetting it in the genocide in Gaza, but also the plight, the curious and tragic plight of Julian Assange, which is coming to a head now. His final appeal coming up in London. As Craig said, he raised the alarm and made the call for people to come out to support Assange, not just in London, but all over the world. We'll give you more updates on that as we get closer to the day. Now, on other news, we want to bring in a couple of other international stories of note and welcome onto the program another guest. His name is Ryan Christian. He is also the founder of the Last American Vagabond, an indispensable piece of the independent media spectrum. He's joining us on the line right now from the United States, I believe from Nashville, if I'm not mistaken. Ryan, welcome to the program.
Hey, honored to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Did I get that right? Nashville, Tennessee?
Franklin, greater Nashville area. So close enough.
Close enough, yeah. Ryan, appreciate you joining us. And we're also following some of your work at TLAV, the Last American Vagabond. On this case of genocide, just want to get your opening statement and comments on the situation in Gaza, the ICJ interim ruling. If you think that there's going to be some teeth with this, what do you think the implications might be going forward? Russia's also in the dock, very similar case. I know you've also mentioned this. And I also want to talk about the very controversial subject of another accusation of genocide, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang Western China. I want to talk about all of those things, but let's just start with Gaza. Ryan, your thoughts and reflections on where this is at.
You know, I'm actually pretty hopeful at the moment. I actually didn't expect the ruling or the provisional rulings that came out first. I really didn't expect that. I mean, I think we've all become very aware it's a very politicized entity, which doesn't mean that there can't be some positive outcomes, but it's very politicized. And to see that they came out and essentially, you know, the way I look at the ruling, first of all, is that, or the provisional ruling, is that it was in and of itself political, but still a win, right? I think obviously they recognized if they came out and said ceasefire, which I still think they should have. I still think that was the obvious right thing to do, that would have potentially had more negative political outcome. So I think they kind of like weighed the options and realized, well, if we in effect ask a demand that they achieve these things, which by default would be a ceasefire, it's sort of the same thing. You know, I still wish they would have come full force with it, but I think it's a very positive thing. And I think that I never expected Israel to care at all with what the ruling actually said, that they immediately said, we don't care, it's outrageous, whatever. But the win was really about public opinion. And I think that it came out and it showed, like, a lot of average people that have never been involved in this conversation, who just have towed the line about the normal talking points around Israel, are paying attention to this. And they see this. They see the United Nations. They see Oxfam. They see these groups that we've always been told to look to decide these things. And now all these governments are accusing them of anti-Semitism and whatever else. So I think it's a really positive win that average people are recognizing that the Israeli government is committing crimes. You know, and in regard to teeth, I'm hopeful based on that ruling that there will be a positive outcome. I think that most of the judges seem to be pretty aware, at least willing to discuss the larger points of what's going on. So I do think there will be a positive outcome, but I still think this is a win no matter where it goes forward. I think they've lost control of this and they really can't win back the clout that they've had before.
So from an American perspective, were you surprised by the sort of the scale of support and the breadth of support in the U.S. despite all this? There was a lot of intimidation in the media and politically saying that anybody coming out and opposing Israel is pro-Hamas, ergo they're pro-terrorist. All these people flooding Washington, D.C. Week after week after week. Were you surprised by how the young generation as well has taken up this issue? Like, as older or older persons, of our generation, we're used to this issue. We've been living with it for decades, but it's not something that I thought would be at the top of the Gen Z, list of priorities. Your thoughts on that side of things?
Yeah, I would say, I'm surprised to a degree because I think we're all a little bit surprised on how much momentum has gotten, how much they've lost control of the talking points. But I would argue that the reason I'm a little less surprised than what you might expect is because the way that this all went down. Here's the best way to frame this, and I think I point to Dave Smith and his debate about this, where he really laid this out well. That's kind of stuck with me since he said this. That it had Israel, after October 7th, went right to the United Nations and said this was a travesty, this was a atrocity, whatever, they would have, with the support they already maintained, they would have been unparalleled. They would have had nothing, they would have gotten everything they wanted, let's put it that way. Instead, they went full genocide immediately. And so at the very beginning, there was a very difficult time where people were going, I think honest people like us were saying, well, both things obviously matter, right? We have to keep track of all of it. But then it went on, and a week and a month and 2 months, right? And so you're getting to a point to where people are just like, okay, this is impossible not to see. And had they not done that, they would have maintained all of this control over the conversation, but they shook people out of that. I don't think they meant to do so. I think it was very belligerent, and it was, I think it's based on things other than logic, in my opinion. And so I think that happening made me realize that, they shook a lot of average people from this. So then seeing this momentum, I think it goes to show you that as people, as the societies, the masses, we really do have a lot of power over the outcome, over the conversation, and they just don't want you to realize that. And so there's also this kind of counter narrative, which we should consider. I don't think is the case that because that's what's happening, that's what they want to be happening, and therefore it's not, it's kind of like the psychological operation side of it. But I really just believe that they kind of screwed this up. And I think that the average person is aware of it. And so the momentum is justified. And I think, and what it also shows you that I think that, average people want good things. They want the right thing to happen. And we always get pitted against each other. And this is just an example of them recognizing genocide, and they can't stand by it, whether or not they're on different sides of the political spectrum that abuses them,
So people like us, Ryan, that work in the media space, we're kind of impervious to propaganda at this point. We just like immediately we question everything.
Right. Right.
But the young generation, with the onslaught on this issue, like they came out. The mainstream media were completely closed ranks on this. Political class closed ranks. The young people saw right through it. They still came out on the street. That's extraordinary if you think about it, because the rhetoric has always been, oh, it's so easy to brainwash those youngsters, but it doesn't look like it in this case.
Yeah, that exact point I want to comment on. I think that's so important. And this is what I've been saying from the beginning, is it kind of the same thing I was describing with Israel, is that, it very early on was all political. Like, so usually in the past, I said this a moment ago, when something like this happens, Biden, U.S. governments, the Western governments will typically say, or rather allude to the fact that we have to trust, the U.S. UN resolutions. We have to listen to what the international community says, rules-based international order, right? That's always what's being pushed on us. And then when this started, for whatever reason, and I'm weirdly suspicious about this, or not weirdly, I think it doesn't add up for me. And I don't know what that factor is, but the United Nations, Oxfam, human rights groups, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, they came out across the board and said, this is a problem. What they're doing is genocide. Yes, we condemn over here, but this is really important and serious. And so immediately you had these generations that have been told and taught and coached into always looking to these bodies. And all of a sudden, those bodies were saying genocide. So you have this moment where they're going, timeout. I've got all the political sphere telling me that's wrong, but 30 seconds ago, they were telling me to look to the UN bodies, and now they're telling me they're wrong. And so it was this very positive moment of kind of waking up from that kind of illusion. And I think that it's going to be really hard to put that toothpaste back in the bottle. I don't think it's possible.
I'm talking with Ryan Christian. He's founder of the Last American Vagabond, excellent independent media source. We're going to take a break with TNT, Today's News Talk. And when we come back, I want to talk to Ryan about the other ICJ case against Russia, get his thoughts on the conclusion there, or as the next stage might come on that as well, and the Uyghur Genocide controversy. We'll look into this story a little bit deeper, all this and more on the other side. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a few minutes.
TNT's Bruce Torres.
The WHO's proposed treaty will increase man-made pandemics, by Meryl Nass. Just a minute about this. This report is designed to help readers Think about some big topics. How to really prevent pandemics and biological warfare. How to assess proposals by the WHO and its members for responding to pandemics. And whether we can rely on our health officials to navigate these areas in ways that make sense and will help their populations. We start with a history of biological arms control and rapidly move to the COVID pandemic, eventually arriving at plans to protect the future. She didn't put protect in quotes, but I just did verbally.
World Stage and Brewster Torres on today's News Talk TNT. Today's News Talk Radio.
Now we're talking. Turn it up now.
TNT.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. We're still in the second hour of this live broadcast. Thank you very much for rejoining us. Hello to everybody in the TNT chat community. We see you have a healthy group of people in there. That's where we want to be during the live broadcast. That's where the action is. That's where the commentary, that's where the banter is. That's where the memes are being circulated. You want to be there during our live show. Got a great group of people in there. We're also going to drop a link to Ryan Christian's website, The Last American Vagabond. You also want to follow Ryan on Twitter, or X, formerly known as Twitter, and other platforms where he resides. We'll talk to him about that before we break as well. Bring back Ryan Christian onto the stage. Ryan, the ICJ, there's another case in there that's not getting as much publicity, but is very, very important in the large scheme of things. I think Russia is defending claims of accusations against it of genocide as well. Your take on this, the results so far on this, what are your thoughts?
I think I talked about this last night. I think I see it as an obvious win for Russia. I mean, this seems like a frivolous case to begin with, quite frankly. And the one thing I always preface with this conversation is, obviously you can disagree. I mean, if you believe that Russia's committing genocide or rather put it very frankly, if you believe the allegations put forward by Ukraine, despite the fact that they've been proven to have lied countless times about what they claim is happening, even from the highest levels of their government, that's up to you. You can choose to do that. But I think it's clear that the evidence does not support the allegation that Russia has been deliberately committing, war crimes is something we get into, rather specifically human rights violations, but genocide, it's really interesting how suddenly the average person has become acutely aware that there are legal metrics to what actually these terms mean. And you can look back and see how frivolously the U.S. government's been throwing that around for so long until now, And so this is an important case where I think the evidence did not meet it. And I think the ICJ made that very clear very quickly. There's no bottom line, as your audience likely knows, they threw out basically everything except the allegation that Russia did not do it's enough due diligence in regard to certain allegations, which, I mean, that's a fair point to make. But at the same time, you got Israel literally claiming openly that they're not going to look into all sorts of things until the war is over. So, it's double standards, So I think ultimately it's a win. And I think that that was the way it was going to go, assuming it was going to be an honest engagement. But I think Ukraine is coming back and arguing that they want another ruling on whether they're committing genocide on certain allegations. I hope this continues to be honest. I also know that Israel is saying they're going to bring an allegation of genocide against Iran because of the statements they make about Israel, which is just, they're trying to water this down to make it all seem ridiculous. And I think it's about trying to make it look like it's a biased court by throwing out these cases that make it look like they're leaning towards the allies of what we're otherwise talking about. I think it is just a win for Russia based on the facts, quite frankly.
Yeah, because all of these have geopolitical implications, don't they? There's powers that are basically filing these cases for certain reasons, either to put pressure on Myanmar, for instance, or on Russia. But the Israel case just basically it forced people to look at more reality, to reprioritize, to say that some things are frivolous, but this is real. And the amount of denial with the Israeli genocide case from the U.S. and other countries backing it, it kind of puts the whole corrupt, kaleidoscope of international relations into focus again, because you can really see what their priorities are. And all these other, as you said, these other filings, there's just nothing there. Doesn't raise to a standard of genocide. So that's kind of a silver lining, I dare say, if there is a silver lining to the tragedy in Gaza. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I do think that it's kind of the larger point we were saying before, or the smaller point in a larger, the larger point around it, that this has broken a lot of things. right? And I really like, we should consider and factor in, which I know you have the earlier points about whether there was foreknowledge, whether there was involvement. I mean, we know, as even Haaretz covered 2 days after October 7th, that they've been openly, or within their groups, funding Hamas for the very purpose of destabilization, but whether or not there was foreknowledge, I think that the way that this was responded to, my personal opinion, is really just a clumsy reaction by Israel, thinking that they have the ability to influence the coverage of what they're doing. And they've shot themselves in both feet, apparently. Like what they've really done, you can't repair this. And I think that is that positive lining and or a silver lining. And that is one thing that the Palestinian resistance has been saying for a long time, that they act in ways that they know that they're going to suffer from, just to try to gain the attention of the world, and that is a successful effort of this. And if I could, one point that I think is important to include in that, since I'm talking about the resistance, as I know you've covered as well, is that we have to remember that whatever your thoughts on Hamas, whatever your thoughts on the group it is, and remember that there was deliberate funding to maintain this radical element to be able to justify no two-state solution by Israel, that ultimately, regardless, the Palestinian resistance, whether it was Islamic Jihad or Hamas, when acting in the on October 7th, was protected under international law as armed resistance under the Fourth Geneva Convention. You just can't ignore that because it's an occupied territory, right? So that's such an important point. Now, when they broke off, and which I think we have to admit, they did kill civilians, they did kidnap civilians. Those are crimes, no matter how you spin it. Now you can get into, how you feel about it, but those are crimes, so that matters. But it doesn't change the fact that it was a protected act under international law. So that changes the entire conversation, And so average people are suddenly becoming aware of these things, which is now flavoring the conversation of Iraq and Syria and the Al-Tanf base that was bombed, not Jordan, right? And there's a reason these things all happen. So it's a really positive note to see how many average people are starting to understand these really important lies.
And that's one of the well, if there's a criticism against Russia in this ICJ case, is that legally they should have done a few other maneuvers in order to sort of buttress their argument, which they didn't seem to do, which was this idea of a Russian invasion. Because if you think about the Donbass, it was being bombarded for 8 years. Russia eventually intervened to stop that, on humanitarian basis or responsibility to protect, to borrow a U.S. policy on that. And so when you compare the situation in Donbass, I know it's not on the scale of the Palestinian situation, but technically Russia intervened. So really, what's the difference technically between those two situations and Gaza is that there's no Russia coming to rescue the Palestinians in Gaza, sadly. But that's, yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
Well, I was just going to say, or you could say that, and this is going to upset some people thinking we're taking a side, but really just say that Russia's actually doing what the U.S. is pretending to doing in a lot of other locations, which that's not to say Russia good guy in some basic way, but it really is just that they are acting in defense both of Syria in many cases, as well as what's going on in Ukraine. Like their actions have been proven, looking back, to be in the defense of their ally, or in this case, the defense of people that needed defending, or Crimea in the same conversation. Like, it's very clear that they're acting in the way that the U.S. claims to justify its actions elsewhere, when really you can prove that they're not even remotely doing that. So it's this inverse of reality in so many different discussions we're having about foreign policy.
Yeah, it is a total inversion. That's exactly. I think that's one of the people that are commenting on the Russian, the legal team and that case in the ICJ. It's turned into an inversion, basically. They're in the dock for protecting the people of the Donbass and being accused of genocide. I'm going to add as well, Ryan, that this conflict in Ukraine, of a conflict of that scale and magnitude, has the lowest, I believe, a civilian to combatant ratios in terms of deaths. So, I mean, it's ridiculously low. In fact, I think it is the lowest of its kind ever. I mean, that should tell you all you need to know about how meticulous Russia has been in prosecuting their military intervention, how they see it. I know this is an invasion. If you're talking to anybody in the West or Ukraine, Russia's characterized it as a special military operation. But without getting too deep in the weeds there, Ryan, the Uyghur Genocide talking point is a powerful one in the United States. The Republicans do not spare any opportunity to bring this up in order to demonize China. And if you challenge the narrative on this, that there is an ongoing Uyghur genocide, you will also be jumped on and piled on by people on the progressive left who, or people from the Muslim Brotherhood sort of spectrum of the Islamic political world, saying, "How dare you downplay this great crime against humanity in Western China, in Xinjiang? How dare you? The Uyghurs are being genocided. Millions of them are being genocided." I'm very skeptical personally of these claims because I have not seen a lot of evidence, Ryan, conclusive evidence to suggest that there is a genocide going on. There's a lot of other things going on there, but I don't think a genocide is one of them. I know you've also commented extensively on this. Your thoughts on this controversial angle?
And as you know, it's definitely a complicated situation, and we should be, considering all data points while questioning everything as always. And I think the point for me, from my opinion, is first and foremost, I think that you can acknowledge that there are, at the simplest case, human rights violations in many cases about, the camps in different places, the way they're being treated. And this in a lot of ways is even at the admission of China, that different terms for the camps they're using, they first lied about and so on. Now that's just a state that I think that's obvious. I think every government of the world is capable and doing them for the most part, most of the ones that we've talked about. But that being said, we have to understand that there's always a lot more going on in in any of these kind of conversations. And I think what we're first of all seeing is that there's an obvious hypocrisy here, a double standard. And that, I guess that's the next secondary point that's very obvious. And you can't pretend that this is, based on what they're framing it as, that this genocide in China is super important and we all have to care, and then completely ignore all of the overlaps of what you're seeing in Palestine or many other locations. So there's just an obvious hypocrisy there, which first, stems some suspicion for me. Then obviously you have to recognize that if there's another point I was going to make, and I just lost on it. But anyway, the bigger point is that ultimately I'm concerned about manipulation from the outside. I think that it's obvious that there is a MO of Israeli entities, of the United States government, Western powers, of using radical Muslims, radical Islam to manipulate other locations. Now, just as a simple reality, we know that's the case in certain locations. We know that this has been done, we just talked about, in regard to Hamas, that they're funding this entity while pointing at them today as the issue. This is a common tactic. Syrian moderate rebels and all these different elements. So it's on the record by China saying that they believe this is partly what's going on, that these groups are being driven, and then you can show that they're doing bombings and attacking and all this different stuff. So based on the logic of what Israel and the United States are claiming about the way they're dealing with these things, you would argue that that's exactly what they're doing, right? So there's this obvious double standard there. But I think what we have to consider is whether that's first and foremost what's creating the situation, which then again doesn't mean that China, China could still very well be committing crimes against these people, which I do think is partly what's happening. But, and that was the other point, is that ultimately then you still have to come back to the reality that there are actual metrics to whether you can use the term genocide. And none of those that I can see are being met. At the very least, there's allegations, but nothing proving a lot of these larger claims, which is a lot of the stuff you see from Ukraine, from Israel, same kind of point. So if you do think it's a genocide and you're going to compare and call them genocide, and on one side of it, you're demanding all of these certain things be met in court of law, but not on the other, it shows you a very clear political agenda, right? And I think that this is always what we have to see. It's not always that, none of it's happening or it's everything they claim. It's pretty obviously, in my opinion, the usual today is that they use real things. They use human suffering. They use the plights of these peoples and drive it from the top, or, they don't even know they're being manipulated. In any case, I think that's largely what's happening. I agree with you. I think that it's being wildly overplayed, which doesn't mean that there aren't actual crimes being committed, not to the level of genocide that I can see. But I think we really just need to start asking how much of this is being orchestrated by these entities. And my show last night, I went through some of the connections that I saw. And these aren't damning main bombshells, but that USAID is very clearly funding a lot of these entities, which is, as far as I'm concerned, that's one of the only things I really need to see these days to know that there's influence there. But you can see some of these Uyghur leaders that are saying today that they stand with Israel in regard to what's going on with Palestine. None of this really makes sense to me unless there's some kind of undue influence there from the outside. But those latter parts are my opinion. I think your main points are whether it's actually genocide, whether they met that, and, that this is not even comparable when you can prove with the evidence on hand.
Well, the evidence is very, very conclusive that thousands of Uyghur fighters joined ISIS and al-Nusra in Syria and still living in Idlib, many of them as well. So, of course, China might have some concern there about this. And there's a breakaway movement there for Turkestan and Turkestanic Republic as well. So plenty of things for China to be worried about. But the ultimate hypocrisy, Ryan, is that you have Republicans in America who seize on the Uyghur issue in order to kind of demonize China and say the Uyghur Muslims in China. And these are the same Republicans that will deride Muslims for just about every other reason they can possibly think of to justify the Middle East policy. I mean, it's pretty outrageous. But this is what. Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
Just if you have to compare, look at the images you can see from what they're doing to Palestinians right now with the blindfolds it's you just, and those are the same kind of images you see that they put out and cry foul about in regard to the Uyghurs, and it's just such an obvious double standard, right? And as to your point, that they seem, you can't continue to argue that in any other aspect these elements of Muslims or Islam or just people from these countries are suddenly a threat by default, but then pretend you care when China acts against them in other ways, even if they are committing crimes. It's just all political. I don't think they care about these human lives at all.
You're actually insinuating that there's inconsistency in U.S. foreign policy, Ryan. How dare you? And hypocrisy. Ryan Christian, Last American Vagabond, give us a shout out before we go to break here about where people can follow you and find your work.
Well, first, thanks for having me on, brother. It's always nice to talk with you, and I think your work's very important, so I hope you keep it up. And TLAV, thelastamericanvagabond.com, just thelastamericanvagabond.com is the URL. That's the best place to check out our work. We have a lot of other things, our Substack and our different platforms, but just going to the main website and continue to support our work. And I do want to give a shout out to Derek doing some great work right now. He's in San Francisco covering the fluoride trial, which if you haven't heard about that, I recommend people check it out. It's important. It's a bombshell development about the obvious that fluoride is dangerous in its own water, and they're trying to keep that from your view. But just the website's where you can find it all. So thanks again, brother.
Yeah, that's Derek Bros, right?
Correct. Yeah, he's one of the writers for TLAV, as well as the Conscious Resistance, which is his platform.
Yeah, he's doing some great work as well. Ryan Christian, thank you very much for joining us on TNT Today's News Talk this week. Much appreciated.
My pleasure.
There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. And we'll drop some of Ryan's links into the TNT chat room as well. Last American Vagabond's website, also X, Twitter. You want to follow Ryan there for updates on what he's doing and his team. We're going to take a break right now and connect with our legal correspondent in New York, Matthew Russell Lee from Inner City Press, on the other side with the latest from inside the Southern District of New York Federal Court, the Trump trials. I want to talk about last week's verdict as well with Matt. All this and more coming up, so stay right there.